Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Mike McCarthy. I'm a volunteer with the Veterans History Museum of the Carolinas. Thank you for turning out for his talk about World War II aircraft. We've got a great speaker here for you. I just want to take a minute to thank our sponsors who helped make this possible. eGolf Jeep, which, of course, if you want to see the real Jeep, come to the museum and see a 1943 Jeep on display. O.P. Taylor's, the coolest toy store on the planet. The Cherry Tree is now out of business, but they've always been big supporters of the museum. TVS, that provides jobs for people with disabilities. And, of course, Ace Hardware, the helpful place. And I want to take just a moment we are losing World War II veterans, and I've just learned that we've lost another one, an Army veteran. Queen Elizabeth has passed away. We're very sorry to hear that. She served in the British Army, I believe. We had one of our veterans, Elizabeth Tilston, was a British Army veteran, an ambulance driver who was in a training class with Queen Elizabeth. So we had a sort of a semi-personal connection there. I would like to recognize the people who have come the farthest. Many of you have come from Hendersonville, but I have learned we have some people all the way from London. And would you stand up and introduce yourselves, please? You get a door prize for coming the farthest. You get to shake the hand of Emmett Casiato, our founding curator of the museum. If it wasn't for Emmett, we wouldn't be here. And Emmett, you have a few words to say.
Thank you very much. When we started the lecture circuit years ago, I never thought it would grow to where we had to move out of the museum and come here and over the Rogo room. So we're really happy about that. And our lecture series, I believe, is really a highlight of our museum. It gives people an opportunity to actually listen to people that have a history and with the things that they speak about. And I'm really excited about that, to have Bob here today. And Bob, in our museum, we do have Bob's uniform, his flight uniform, on one wall, and then we have his dad's articles on another wall. So we have the son and the father in our museum, and we're really happy about that. His father was in the Navy, and we have his Neptune certificate when they crossed the equator. We have that in the museum, and a picture of his father. And his father and him, he cannot deny that's not his father, and vice versa, because they look alike. But anyway, I'm happy to be here today, and I'm happy to have you here today. And please enjoy the lecture. And right now I'm going to pass the baton over here to Greg, and Greg's going to introduce our speaker. Thank you very much, and please continue to come to our lectures. They're great, and I think you'll be inspired today. Thank you.
Thank you. Every month I have a chance to welcome you and to tell you how much I enjoy this series, because I'm in the very fortunate position of getting to meet and get to know somewhat all of the speakers who come here. And it's a tremendous honor, and it's a privilege, and I'm very grateful for that. I'm also grateful for you coming. Today is no exception, because Bob Wilkerson and I have talked over a period of time about this presentation, and Bob's told me a number of things about himself, and running the risk of stealing a little bit of his material, I wanted to mention to you one thing that he told me that sets the stage for today, which is from a very early age. When he was a little boy in Texas, he already knew that he wanted to be a fighter pilot, which was so strange because his mother even said, "He is so little, I have no idea how he even knows what a fighter pilot is." But he already knew, and lo and behold, he became a fighter pilot, which he is going to describe to you. Yep, he really did. Which leads to the question, well, how does World War II get into this? Because Bob is not from World War II. Something else he said to me was, since we're roughly the same age, he says, you know, when we grew up, World War II was everything. Like our whole, world was coming off of World War II. So we learned about all the campaigns, we learned about the aircraft, we learned about the pilots, we built all the plastic models, all of the Revell and Monogram, if you remember, all those models that we built. This is really, who we are. So for me to speak about something, this comes to top of mind. This is what has driven him over all these years since he was a tiny tot, in Texas. So I'll leave it there. He's going to pick up on it. He, I know, is very excited and very grateful to be speaking to you. So Bob, you can take it.
Sure. I think I'll pass if everyone can hear me.
Can anybody hear him?
Can everybody hear me? Am I talking loud enough? I'll use the.
Use the mic.
All right, here we are.
You have a lot of old people here, Bob.
I'm one of these. Well, I'd like to thank you all for being here today to listen to me bloviate about one of my favorite topics, which is World War II and World War II aviation. And like Greg said, I can't ever remember not wanting to be a pilot. I can't ever remember not wanting to be a fighter pilot. And I think that came from, I can still remember the first ride I ever got in an airplane. My uncle Lick, was one of my father's elder brothers. He was watching us one day and he had an airplane. So we went out to the airport in Norman, Oklahoma, and he put my brother in the back seat. I must have been 4 or 5 years old, and he set me in my brother's lap. And he put the seatbelt on us, started the airplane up, we went up, and we flew around. And from that day, I started thinking airplanes. I wanted to do airplanes. I didn't know how I was going to do it. I didn't even know what they were, but I wanted to fly an airplane. My mother hit the ceiling. She was not impressed with the decision process of my uncle, to which she let him know. And so, now then, let's fast forward to 1963, because I had another experience in an aircraft. In 1963, I was in the 11th grade, and the summer of that year, I had heard that there was a bunch of World War II airplanes at Brownwood, Texas Airport. So I hopped on my motorcycle and I drove over there, and they had there a P-51 and they had an F-8, P-40 and a B-25 and all kinds of World War II airplanes. That was the maintenance facility for the time of the commemorative Air Force. And one of the founding fathers was a guy named Lefty Gardner. When I saw all those airplanes, I went into the secretary and I said, I'd like to see Mr. Gardner. Why is that? Well, I'd just like to see him. Okay, let me go see him. So she went back there and he said, come on back, he'll talk to you. So I went back there and I said, Mr. Gardner, I want to work for you. I won't count the hours. I'll do you a good job. What do you say? He said, why do you want to do this? Who are you again? So I told him about myself, and I finally talked him into giving me a job. I lived on the airport in a room that was right next to the men's latrine. And I would get up at night, or stay up at night, and walk out in the hangar when everything else was closed. And I'd sit in one of those airplanes with one of the flight manuals, and I'd read about it and entertain in my own mind what it would be like to fly that thing.
And with that summer, when the summer was over, I started testing Lefty, who was a B-17, B-24 pilot in World War II. He was when he was 19, growing up on a farm in the valley. He decided to enlist when the Japanese attacked us December the 7th. He enlisted in the Air Force and went to pilot training and drew a B-17, B-24. And so he was the real deal. I started pestering him anyway about getting a ride in P-51. Not just sitting in it, a real ride. I pestered him until he finally called me up one day and said, okay, come on over here, Bob, and I'm going to fly the P-51, you be in the back seat. So I went over there, it was November of 1963. We had a small briefing and talked about what we were going to do. He put me in the back seat, which was, they took the fuselage fuel tank out of the airplane, took all the armor off of it, removed the guns, of course they had been removed. So this was a full-powered P-51D that was about 2,000 pounds lighter than the war-fighting version. So it really scooted. Had a 1,695 horsepower engine. It was spinning a 450-pound, 12-foot prop. So you really had to know what you were doing. So he put me in the back seat. We were lined up on the end of the runway, and Lefty turned around and looked at me and said, "Now don't you go throwing up on me." So we took off, had an amazing time. It just set my course. I knew that not only when we got on the ground, I can remember thinking, I can do this. I've got to start thinking about how I'm going to do it. But I'm going to convince somebody to give me the training and all this kind of stuff, because I can do this, and I want to do this. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Now, what we're going to talk about today, after I finish this. When I graduated from high school, part of my plan was to go to Texas A&M, which I did. It was class of '69. In that period of time, Texas A&M was all male, all military, and it was not a real pleasant experience. But I did that. I was commissioned and went into the Air Force, went to pilot training. And after I went to pilot training, my first assignment, I flew C-141s. C-141s are a four-engine, multi-engine jet aircraft that would supply the armed forces throughout the world. We flew to Vietnam and other places in the world. I did that for 5 years, and when I separated, I stayed in the Guard and the Reserve. And I'm the luckiest guy in the world because I decided that I was going to use that vehicle to get to fly fighter. So I found myself a place that would train me in flying fighters. The first plane I flew, fighter jet, that one right there. Can you see that little bit of red top? It's the top airplane right there. That's called an A-37B. It was a ground attack fighter. It had a gun in the nose and it would carry bombs. And it was so simple of an airplane that it was like flying a War II fighter with no prop. From there, I was able to, I guess you'd say, BS my way into flying with the Texas Air National Guard. And for 5 years, I flew the next airplane down there. That's an F-101. It's a supersonic jet interceptor. And all I can say that is that if you ever fly an F-101, don't get slow, don't get slow, and don't get slow. You might not survive if you do. After 5 years of flying the F-101, I flew the F-4C. The F-4, you might notice that for those of you, looks like the majority of you were alive during Vietnam. That's one of the primary fighter jets that we used during Vietnam. I flew that airplane for 6 years, and then I got to fly the F-16. I was 43 years old when they sent me to F-16 school, which I was impressed with myself. You just don't get to go to F-16 school when you're 43 years old. However, there's kind of approach avoidance situation in that they do need some adults to herd the cats. So I had almost achieved the adult status now, and I got to go to the F-16. And I got to fly it for a little over a year, and it's the most amazing airplane that I've ever flown in my life. And I'm very fortunate to have flown it. And my boss came to me and said, would you like to start up a flying program in support of counter-drug, war on counter-drug? And I said, who gets to do that? Nobody gets to do that. So they gave me a bunch of money. I hired a bunch of people. I was the commander of the first counter-drug flying program. And it was so interesting that I stayed on a second tour of active duty. This tour took 8.5 years. And I took a 8.5 year leave of absence from Continental Airlines and retired from the military after starting that program up, getting it all trained, writing a big report, and all that kind of stuff. When I retired from the Air Force in 1999, I went back to Continental Airlines, flew 4 years for them, and then retired. So I've been retired, I would like to say productively, but all I've done then since I've retired in 2003 or 4, is I've been able to read whatever I wanted to read, whenever I wanted to read it. I've learned more about physics. It's been a real thrill to be retired. But that's the last of the I Love Me part of my program. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about a totally amazing organization and what they did, who they did it with, and what they did it with. We're going to talk about the 8th Army Air Force. And that was the organization that supported and had these kind of airplanes, the P-38, P-47, and the P-51D. These are the 3 airplanes that defeated the Nazi Germany in the air in World War II. From where they started, there's a couple of reasons. They started at a very low place to start from. They were able to learn how they were mistaken when they started out, and then field a fighting force that defeated a superior enemy, both from airplanes, tactics, and experience, because the Nazis had been fighting air wars since the Spanish Civil War in 1936, so they knew what they were doing. Then we're going to talk about the guys that took those planes and flew against the Nazis.
Isn't that when they destroyed the Luftwaffe?
Oh yes, the Luftwaffe was destroyed. And those airplanes and the guys I'll talk about are the reasons why they did it. Now then, the 8th Air Force had the mission statement of they're going to destroy Germany's ability to wage war. And getting there, they're going to gain command of the European skies and pave the way for the Allied invasion in 1944. how they were going to do this. The doctrine that they went to war with when they sent Ira Aker, who was the first commander of the 8th Army Air Force, when they sent him overseas, the doctrine of his organization was they were going to use the heavy bombers, the B-17s and the B-24s, to destroy the industrial war-making capability of Germany. The strategy that they were going to use is that the bombers were going to be able to fight their way into and fight their way out of the targets that they were bombing. Therein lies a little problem that I'd like to talk to you guys about. The result of this, fast forward to 1943, they've had about a year and a half of figuring out something ain't working. The Germans helped them put an exclamation on this ain't working by the missions that they flew against Stuttgart, Regensburg, Schweinfurt. After those missions, which averaged about 22% losses of military aircraft, they had to say, okay, we're not going to do this daylight precision bombing anymore because the losses are just too high. We're going to think about it a bit. And what happens in any kind of a big organization when a failure of this magnitude happens? Well, the first thing is the head guy goes away. So they replaced RC Eaker with a guy named Jimmy Doolittle. Jimmy Doolittle was a disruptor. He came in there and said, we're going to do something different. We'll talk about that. So, 1944, things changed. What really changed was the attitude from the command section on down. The first thing that changed, might not be the first, like I was saying, the first thing that changed was that the concept of fighters defending the bomber formations that were attacking the place. They went from a concept of defense, which means that the fighters would stay close to the bombers and ward off enemy fighters. They went to the concept of the fighters' goal was to destroy the Luftwaffe. It doesn't sound like a big thing. What it meant is that instead of waiting for somebody to attack you, you went out and turned your 20-year-old testosterone-poisoned fighter pilot loose on an enemy. That lowered the bomber loss rate and made a big difference. When you combine that kind of an attitudinal change with these three airplanes, it changed the tenure and the progress in the war effort. When you have the tactical change and the latest versions of these airplanes, which the P-51 could escort our bombers now all the way into Germany and escort them out. So that meant that if the German fighters wanted to really shoot down one of our bombers, they had to first fight off a swarm of American fighter pilots. So it made a real big difference. The first airplane that we're going to talk about is P-38. All right. I got ahead of myself. I'll make a note of that. fighters, any kind of a fighter, has got to have the proper power source in order to go fast or to turn tightly. These airplanes could do both of them. One of them in particular could do it less well, but we'll talk about that. So the ability to go fast and to turn tight is the first thing I would say that makes a good fighter. The second thing is the armament package. So you get behind somebody, what kind of weapons do you have to destroy that guy in a very short amount of time? That's dependent on how heavy of an armament or a bullet, a projectile that the guns throw, and their cyclic rate, how much weight can the weapon put out. You didn't want any one of these fighters, I'll tell you, to get behind you. That was the equivalent of, I wish you were dead. Because it just didn't happen that you got away free without having an airplane on your tail. The combat radius in Europe required a combat radius of, I'd say, 600-700 miles. So when you took off out of London or someplace in England, you'd fly 500 miles, 600 miles. Then you had a period of time, if you were going to escort the bombers to the target and defend them and fly back, you needed to be able to fly 500 or 600 miles to Germany. You needed to be able to engage the enemy, which was 20 minutes, 30 minutes, something like that. Then you need to fly back, and hopefully without running out of gas. Number one, you don't want to run out of gas in any airplane, much less one that's over enemy territory and all that. So the last thing is the best attributes of any fighter airplane is the stick actuator, the pilot. These guys, whoever says, you can say I fly fighters, or you can say I'm a fighter pilot. If you fly fighters, doesn't mean that you are a fighter pilot, because it takes the correct attitude. You've got to be able to make split-second decisions on whether or not the poker game of aerial combat is biasing for you or against you, and you've got to make a decision, and then you've got to commit. And so we did have a tremendous training program, and most of our pilots, successful fighter pilots, had prior experience, either military or civilian, before they got into flying combat. And their attitude was, if you even think that you can't do something, you're right. So don't put yourself in that position. You've got to get yourself mentally prepared that I'm going to win. Too bad about my buddy on the left, too bad about my buddy on the right. They may not be coming back, but I am, and I'm going to win. There's nothing that takes the place of that. So, the P-38 Lightning, this has got to be the best looking airplane. Just about. I mean, it's really a nice looking airplane. It's just beautiful. It was made by the Lockheed Corporation. Lockheed Corporation, is that better? Yes. I'm sorry. Lockheed Corporation, it was their first combat aircraft that they ever made. That was a problem. This airplane had a lot of versions, had like 18 versions made during the war, because they were constantly trying to solve some kind of a problem. This was powered by two of Allison 12-cylinder supercharged, or correction, turbocharged engines, 1710. And that was another problem because they were very finicky. They had a turbo supercharger that was kind of sensitive to how you used it with how fast you moved the throttle and all those kind of things. It wasn't hard to catch your engine on fire. It wasn't hard to have an engine failure by either not knowing what to do with it, with the throttle levers. The armament was a good set of armament. It had a 120 millimeter cannon, 4 50 caliber machine guns. That was about the strongest point of this aircraft because being on the center line of the aircraft, let me come back here. You see on the picture on the right, see the cannon, the machine gun barrels in the right photograph, right? Well, that meant that you had about 1,000-yard capable weapon. The normal fighter of the period had their weapons mounted in the wing, so there was a convergence of the weapon. They had to be pointed kind of inboard, so they crossed at about 350 yards out in front of your aircraft. So to bring the heaviest weight of fire, you had to maneuver the airplane about 350 yards behind the guy, or you weren't going to bring all the guns to bear. You didn't have to worry about that with this because they were on the center line of the aircraft. And all you had to do was get in plane with the guy, turn the guns on, and if he was 1,000 yards or less, you could probably hit it. It wasn't that easy, however, because that guy didn't want you to shoot him down. But so the P-38 was extremely fast, which is good, but it also meant that it was susceptible to compressibility. And what compressibility in this period of time meant, you could go so fast that the airflow over the control surfaces was disrupted and you lost control of the airplane. And that could be deleterious to one's health. So, the other thing that I found very interesting about this airplane and why it didn't really have a great history in European theater of war, but it did really well in the Pacific and the Mediterranean, and it did really well in North Africa. And that's because there wasn't very much cockpit heat. And so if you took off and you had a 5-hour mission escorting bombers up at above 25,000 feet, you were going to be cold for a lot of time. And that was a real problem because the colder you get, the less efficient you are at looking around and seeing the enemy and protecting the bombers and all that kind of stuff. So as soon as the Army Air Force, 8th Army Air Force, was able to get long-range P-51s, they started moving these fighters to other areas where they were more effective. But other than that, it was a great-looking airplane. Now, I'm sure if there was a P-38 pilot in here, I would have to leave the room because people that flew this thing, including Jimmy Doolittle, who was the commander of the 8th Air Force, he said the P-38 was the sweetest flying airplane he'd been in. So he loved the P-38. I don't think Jimmy Doolittle flew it in combat. This thing was a twin-engine aircraft, very high performance, and it wasn't set up right as far as the switches being in the right place. It took a lot of effort and a lot of movements to take it from a cruise condition to a fighting condition in the airplane. You had to make sure, take some time, and get your power set up and make sure your gas feed is properly set up, that you weren't going to run out of gas, which one of the guys later did run out of gas in the middle of a fight in a P-38, which he had an expletive that he used to describe what he felt like about that. So, but anyway, this was the only real top-notch airplane we had to fight in Europe when the war broke out. So the next one I gotta take is not just because Ed Cottrell is here, who is a P-47 pilot. This airplane was I would say primary to winning the war. This airplane is a P-47. It was fast. It was maneuverable. When they got the bubble canopy and they got a new prop, it would climb really well. If there's a problem with this airplane, is that people, when they first went into it, probably came out of something else. They probably said, I don't want to fly anything this big. It would be very easy to hit. But they did not understand that this thing had such a robust engine. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine could take damage like nobody's business. You could shoot off one of the cylinders and this thing had a good chance of bringing you back to your home base. It was a flying machine gun hornet's nest. This thing had 8 .50 caliber machine guns. 8. That's a lot of firepower. That means you can destroy things not only in the air, but it was very, very highly touted as a ground attack aircraft also. Like it says here, it was very fast. It could disengage from combat by diving away from somebody that was on his tail if you had enough altitude. It was an excellent fighter bomber. And it was, like I said, one of the toughest airplanes of the war. I was talking to Ed before this presentation, and I said, I've just recently come to the conclusion that as far as winning the war, I'm not just talking about the air war, I'm talking about the war. I think that this airplane, as a fighter, had the most effect of any of our airplanes, except maybe the Enola Gay, which dropped an atomic bomb on people. So this was, all kidding aside, this was a really war-fighting machine. It had a gross weight of about 16,000 pounds, which means, yes, it was heavy, and it might not have been as maneuverable as one of the German fighters like the Me-109 or the Focke-Wulf 190, but in the hands of a capable pilot with the right attitude, you could defend yourself quite nicely in this airplane. It was an amazing piece of machinery. And now this is what used to be my favorite airplane. The one I got a ride in was the P-51 Mustang. The P-51 Mustang developed from the war, from the beginning of the war. The A models had an Allison engine, like the P-38. It was a good engine at lower altitudes, and it had a reputation as being very fast and very maneuverable. It could not fly very high and do its mission. When they got the Bs, the P-51Bs and the P-51Ds, they had to borrow an engine design from the English. It was called the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. It was licensed to the Packard company to build in the States, and it had a twin-stage, twin-speed supercharger, which means that it could fly up to 30,000 feet and above, produce the same power that it did at sea level, and it turned into just a fire-breathing monster as an air-to-air aircraft. The only weakness that it had was that it was liquid-cooled. One bullet through the radiator could knock the airplane out if it drained all its coolant. So the response to that is, don't let anybody get behind you where they could shoot at it. Of course, they shoot you in the front too, so just be careful. If you're going to be a fighter pilot, just be careful. As far as the armament package, it was great. They had 6 50 caliber machine guns. They probably had a cyclic rate of fire of 800 rounds a minute. So when you pulled the gun trigger down, and you sent a stream of about 4,800 bullets per minute toward whatever you were shooting at. That was good. The reason that it was so fast wasn't just because of the Packard Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, but it had completely redesigned kind of a pace-setting design of what they call little low-drag laminar flow wing. And not to get too technical, but most wings are, at this period, were thicker at the front of the wing than any other part of the wing. When you take that thickness and move it back a third of the way, it creates a wing that has less drag, which means it's going to be a faster wing. It's going to be more efficient use of fuel. So that's where this statement here with the superb fuel efficiency and capacity. By the time the P-51D came out, we had developed what's called drop tanks that you would place underneath either wing. It extended the range of the P-38 and the P-51 and the P-47, but it really made the P-51 the go-to answer when it came to escorting bomber formations all the way into Germany, to like Berlin, and fight and come back and land at the base if you were lucky to make it, enough to make it back. The other thing that the P-51D brought to the foreground is that the bubble canopy on the P-51D. That meant the pilot, I never met a fighter pilot that's not paranoid. And that's because it was a way to save your life. If you're in a fighter pilot, or you're in a fighter airplane in combat, what you've got to train yourself to do is look around. Look around all the time. And if you're not doing anything, if you're just up there, just like that, look around, because there might be somebody that's trying to get you in their gun sights. So the canopy on the P-51D was a real work of art, and it let people see things a lot better. And that's one of the reasons that it's a really good airplane. Now then, like I said before, equipment is equipment. The fighter pilot with a 4-pound Mark I brain, he's the guy that takes that and turns it into a weapon. And these guys were weapons. I've picked some of the people that are my heroes as just as an American, but as a fighter pilot, these guys were it. So, two guys that are a couple of my favorite. They're not the highest scoring guys, but they were the guys that took a wing, or correction, a group of fighter pilots would direct the battle and keep everything moving along and all that. They were the flying commanders of two groups. Each one of these groups is famous because they're a member of the 1,000 Destroyed Club. These two groups, 3 squadrons, 48 airplanes, they destroyed both in the air and on the ground. Each one of them destroyed over 1,000 enemy aircraft. They did it under the command of Colonel Hub Zemke. He was a professional fighter pilot for the war. He knew his business. He shot down 17 and 3/4 airplanes because he shared a couple of victories. And he developed what became the accepted tactic, which was called the Zemke fan, which when the bombers were freed up from having to be in close contact with the bomber groups, would range out in front of the bomber groups, locate the enemy, and engage them to protect the bombers. He was a fantastic airborne leader. When he was flying one mission, he got into a thunderstorm that tore the wing off his airplane. He bailed out and was taken prisoner, so he spent the last several months of the war as a prisoner of Stalag Luft 1. The second guy, Colonel Don Blakesley, he went to pilot training in, I believe he went to pilot training in Canada, but he became commander of the 4th Fighter Group, and he shot down 14 and a half enemy airplanes, and the 4th Fighter Group, like I said, was a member of the 1,000 Club. He was the first guy to fly a P-51 over Berlin. He was the real deal also. He had a lot of aces in his group. So, but these two groups, I can't tell you how their reputation is just unbelievable. They brought the war to the end. Now then, if there's a fighter pilot's fighter pilot, let me tell you, it is Robin Olds. If there was a stereotypical fighter pilot, it's Robin Olds. Robin Olds had such a reputation, especially after Vietnam, which he shot down 4 MiGs in Vietnam. The story was that Robin Olds was going to be freeze-dried, put in a glass case in the circular ring A of the Pentagon with a sign on it that's saying, "In case of war, break glass." This guy married a movie actress after World War II. He was a football player. He shot down 5 Germans in a P-38. There was only somewhere 17 aces that flew the P-38 in Europe, and he's one of them. He was a squadron commander at 22 years of age. When 22, I'm not 4 times that age yet. However, I'm getting there. When his unit was converted to P-51s, he went on to shoot down another. This was in mid-44 now. He scored another 8 victories. And then if that wasn't enough, he was able to get himself assigned in Vietnam, take over an F-4 wing there, and he shot down 4 MiGs in Vietnam. And I gotta take another minute. He designed what was called Operation Bolo in Vietnam, which was, he took his F-4s, he disguised them both electronically and flight plan and all this kind of, like they were F-105s. F-105s in Vietnam were basically bombers. They were not air-to-air fighters. So he presented an electronic picture with the ground track of an F-105 mission in hopes of suckering up the North Vietnamese of thinking this is a 105 mission. When the 105 mission turned out to be an F-4 mission, and the MiG-21s that responded went, uh-oh, then we shot down 7 MiG-21s in one mission, and that was 50% of the North Vietnamese MiG-21 that they had. This guy, in case of war, break glass. This guy really was a real deal. He retired as a brigadier general after Vietnam. He was always kind of he spoke truth to power. That's all I'll say about that. He ended up, he did not retire from the commandant of the U.S. Air Force Academy. He went to the safety office because the powers that be wanted him. They didn't want to have to deal with him. So he's one other thing. That mustache right there, that got him in a lot of trouble. His name was Robert O. Now then, this slide, me and Greg talked about whether or not we should include this slide, but you can't talk about the P-38 without talking about Richard Bong. Richard Bong is the ace of aces of America. He's the highest scoring ace of World War II and of all time since there have been pilots in the American military. He flew the P-38 in the Pacific area. He shot down 40 airplanes, 40. That's just amazing. The guy that was number 2 was a guy named Tom McGuire. He shot down 38. Tom McGuire, unfortunately, was killed, and Richard Bong survived the war, but then went back to the States. He was testing the first fighter jet that we developed, and he died when had an engine failure on takeoff, and he had done all of this stuff, and he died at 24. That's, I don't know what to say about that, and I'm rarely at a loss for words. This guy was the real deal. He won the Medal of Honor. He had it pinned on him by Douglas MacArthur. He's our ace of aces. Now then, as far as P-47 I'll have to ask Ed. Did you know this fellow by any chance, Ed? I've got a question for you when I finish here. This guy was the real deal. He shot down 27 Germans on his first or second mission. He got so badly shot up, he had 21 holes in his airplane from a 20-millimeter cannon. He also, the airplane that he was flying that blasted all the way back where he landed in England, it had 210 30 caliber holes in it. So he was shot to pieces. The P-38 with the R-2800 engine stuck together. He couldn't get out of the airplane. He tried a couple of times, but his canopy was locked. It couldn't get it open, couldn't jump out. So what are you going to do? Well, I think I'll fly back to Eden. He did that, got on the ground. He was part of that Herbert Hub Zemke's 56 fighter wing, and he was the first Air Force Army Air Corps pilot to best Eddie Rickenbacker's score of 26 in World War I. And so he was, what can you say? He is a hero. As all these guys. This guy. Did you know this guy too? Yeah.
I knew him better than I did Johnson.
We need to get you here and tell us. I can't believe that I met somebody today that knew Robert S. Johnson, who wrote a book after the war called Thunderbolt. I have to recommend you read that book. It's a very amazing book. This guy, as a civilian pilot, his instructor said, "You know, I hate to tell you this, Gabby, you ain't got it. You need to not fly airplanes. You need to just go over and learn to play the harp or something. Just do something else." And bummed him out. So he went back to Notre Dame, then to get involved in the war. So he goes to pilot training. He faced an elimination ride because the guy said, "You just ain't got it. Don't." He went to his elimination ride. The guy passed him. Then he got the big picture. And he goes, okay, so he graduates. He goes to Hawaii. He's in Hawaii when the Japanese attack. He's flying a P-36, which was a forerunner of the P-47. He takes off, but the Japanese have already skedaddled, so he wasn't able to fire his guns. But he showed up. Now, when the war ended, Gabby Gabreski had shot down 28 Germans. He exceeded Robert S. Johnson's score by 1. So he was the leading ace in Europe for World War II. He was a Polish American. He flew when he started out in Europe, he flew with a Polish squadron with the RAF. So he flew the Spitfire. Then he went back to the P-47. He had an interesting experience platform to deal from. When the war ended, he was recalled. He flew F-86s in Korea and shot down 6.5 MiG-15s in Korea. The guy, from a very questionable start, he's the number 3 ace in the book of aces from the U.S., Gabby Gabreski. So, he's one of 7 aces with 5 or more victories in 2 wars. I would have liked to have met him. I'd like to have a beer with him because he would have been an interesting guy to talk to. I can guarantee. This guy. Dominique Gentile. He shot down 29.83 airplanes, so 0.83. That means he got one that he shared equally with one guy, and he got one-third of another airplane that he shared with two other people. So that means that's what the 2983 was. He went to training in the Canadian Air Force and went over to England. He flew with the RAF squadrons. The RAF squadrons were 3 squadrons of Americans that volunteered to fly with the RAF. He flew the Spitfire. He scored 2 victories in Spitfire. In late 42, he transferred over to the Army Air Corps, the 8th Air Force. Their first airplane was a P-47, and they transitioned to P-51s, and he joined up with a friend of his, a guy named John Godfrey, and they were a fighting team. That fighting team destroyed over 32 aircraft together, them as a team. He received a Distinguished Flying Cross, or one of the Distinguished Service Medals, and when General Eisenhower pinned it on him, General Eisenhower called him a one-man Air Force. When FDR heard about the exploits of not only Dom Gentile, but John Godfrey, he called Gentile Captains Courageous. Unfortunately, as fighter pilots will do, he was hot dogging in front of the press one day, and he was doing a low pass over the airfield, and he dug his airplane into the ground. He survived, but it just upset Don Blakesley, who was the commander who we mentioned before. He sent him home. Said, I don't care how many people you're shooting down, we can't have you being a real, true idiot and flying your airplane into the ground. So he sent him home. In 1951, unfortunately, he was flying the trainer version of the P-80, which is the T-33. He lost an engine in the T-33 and was killed in the crash. So, all I can say is you did a good job while you were with us, and you're one of my heroes. And this guy's from Goldsboro, North Carolina. He was one of the post-war U.S. Air Force Chief of Staff, a guy named John C. Meyer, who was a 24-kill ace in World War II, flew P-51s. He said, this guy is the perfect fighter pilot. That's pretty high praise from a 4-star general. He's the highest score P-51 ace. He scored 6 victories in one day. I can't tell you how in the moment you had to have been to do that. It's just amazing. Unfortunately, on his last mission, he was real low. They were attacking a ground target, and the friendly forces, the Allied forces, air defense people didn't get the word. There's some friendlies in the area, and he flew over a quad-mounted 50 caliber air defense gun. That gun fired 60 rounds, and it hit him, and he crashed and died, and he was 25 years old. So he didn't make it back. when I found this, I looked at this. This is George Freddy's rules to live by. This is what he used to practice these and think about these every day. If you look at these, the first 8 are directly attributable to being successful as a pilot. The rest, all 13, are good rules to live by for anybody. So, no smoking. Why does that affect a pilot? If you smoke, your body thinks that you're at 5,000 feet when you're standing on the ground. That's because carbon dioxide combines with hemoglobin in your blood at a much faster rate than oxygen does. So your visual acuity isn't as great as it would be if you didn't smoke. So the first thing there's nothing better than a fighter pilot that has excellent vision. That gives you an advantage. If you can see better than the next guy, you might be able to sneak up on him. So that's good. Drink intelligently and sparingly. Yes. That's all I can say. Eat sensibly. Yes. Exercise regularly and diligently. If you don't have command over your body in an airplane that's pulling up to 6 Gs, 7 Gs maybe, or if you're an F-16, 9 Gs, you're lost. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. So stay fit. Learn all possible about flying or any other job at hand. Amen. You've got to learn all your life. Always be willing to go out of the way to learn something new. You cannot be successful in a competitive endeavor unless you're willing to learn new things. Always try to give the other man a boost. Amen. Take care of your wingman. He'll take care of you. Fight hardest when down and never give up. I will put in one word about Texas A&M. Texas A&M taught me 3 things. It wasn't out of a book, but the guys that were there, they must have known it. And there's 3 rules to life, and that is, don't give up. Number 2, don't give up. And number 3, don't give up. If you can take those and apply them to your life, you'll probably be successful. That's my story, and again, I'm sticking to it. Now I'd like to ask Ed a question. Tell us about flying the P-47, and tell us about the 2 fellows we talked about, Gabreski and Johnson, if you don't mind. Let me give you this microphone. Thank you, Ed.
All I can say is that if you flew P-47, like I was fortunate to do, you were able to come back alive. And I'm here today because if I'd have been in any other aircraft, I would not have made it back. The P-47 is a tremendous airplane, and it's the engine actually saved my life. As far as the gentleman that you saw on the screen, those guys were put in a position where they flew escort almost every mission, where we flew strafing missions. We supported the tanks and the infantry. They flew escort to support the bombers. And God bless them, to fly escort, and you're flying 10 hours a day on a mission when it's cold and you never know what's going to hit you. You got to be tough to do that. So I respect those guys, and they earned everything that they accomplished. But I certainly love my P-47. Believe me.
Thank you very much, Ed. Now then, unfortunately, or fortunately, I did not get to fly in World War II. I probably wouldn't be here, but I will try and answer any of your questions. Go ahead.
Well, Gretzky, he didn't on his last mission, he went too low, and he was supposed to get married. He was supposed to get married
on his
6
last
months,
mission.
and then he ended up in a stall.
What happened was that he had received orders for the state. Going back, you know, what happened was that Francis Cabreski had completed his tour. He was the highest scoring ace, blah, blah, blah. Then his boss had sent him home to do a war bond tour or something like that. He stopped by operations and he said, I think I'll fly one more mission. Just one. What can happen? Well, what happened was he was attacking a ground target and his bullets were going over it, so he pushed forward on the stick a little bit to bring the bullets down onto the target. Well, that meant he must have been flying at 12 feet when the bullets were missing. When he pushed down a little bit, his prop, which would have a ground strike at about 7 feet or something like that, hit the ground, he crashed. He spent the latter part of the war in a Stalag Luft number 1. And so be careful when you say, I think I'll do one more. However, about a couple of weeks later, Zemke, his airplane came apart, like I said, in one mission. He bailed out, and he joined Cabreski at Stalag 1. So they had a time to sit around and think about what it meant to be a fighter. Are you heading off? Okay, anything else? How'd I do on time, Craig?
Oh, way over.
You know, I really did work on that. However, I'm kind of Boyle's law of gaseous diffusion. I'll expand the film space, whatever.
It was great.
Go ahead. Tom.
People, you can't spend enough time with this guy. Every Thursday I get a briefing, and he turns into a different person when he's talking about his own personal flying. Just tell one story. He's a jet man. Tell one story about being a jet man. I mean, you've told me several, but the guy that flipped on you, and that's when you saw God. I mean, you survived. But you have so many stories like that, where you're in there and stuff happens, and it's instant.
All right. I'm.
Mike.
I'll tell you.
It's Bob.
I don't know if I can do this or not, but I will talk about one of my favorite topics, which is obviously me. I was flying an F-16, and we were, no, I was flying an F-4. We hadn't gotten our F-16 yet. And the thing about an F-4, it's a good airplane, but it's an old airplane. It would turn like this to the maximum. If you really were a man about it, set your wings full, 6G, 7G turn, it would turn like this. An F-16, if that guy really wants to turn it, it'll turn it like this. It's amazing. I have never seen an airplane turn like that. I was flying an F-4. Our sister unit had gotten their F-16s, but there were new guys in their F-16. So my flight lead said, we're gonna mess with these guys because I don't think they know how to run the radar. Because in the F-4, you had a guy in the back run the radar. And the F-16, your guy in the back was your left hand. Because you controlled the radar, the weapons, the attack mode, everything with your left hand. That's a skill set. It's not hard to learn, but it takes some focused, concentrated muscle skill memory, learning what it does, and thinking about what kind of situation you're going to select, what weapon, radar, blah, blah, blah. So if you were smart, you said, okay, I'm going to learn one or two of them, and then concentrated on that and all this kind of stuff. So me and the guy I was flying with, I was on his wing. He says, we're just going to go into the fight presenting one target, which means that I would tuck in with a little wing overlap. So we would project to the guys we were going to engage one target. And then when flight lead me, when we decided that we were in the other groups, what they call the Doppler notch on the radar, which means that the radar would break lock, and then before it got relocked on, you might have a chance to trick him and he would lose sight of it. So he said, when I call break or something like that, I would go out, plug in the afterburner, point up, and just go until I'm 10 or 15,000 feet above the fight. And so we do this. The F-16s that we were flying again, number one, I should say that if you're in an F-4 and you engage with an F-16, you're going to die. It's just in training, you might not die, but you'll wish you're dead because they're going to eat cheese on you all for the rest of the time because they're just. So we go into this fight. The F-16s are coming at us at a 6,000-foot spread or so. What means one guy's here and one guy's here, and we're coming at them in a formation kind of like this with wingtip overlap. So we're presenting one radar target to them. My lead, a guy named Popeye Doyle, who had shot down a MiG in Vietnam, he says, break. And so I go like this, plug in the afterburners, go up. Now I roll upside down, and I get sight of Popeye. He's turning on the lead airplane, and the lead airplane on the other side, his wingman is looking for me. Because you can see him rolling around. He's looking for me because he doesn't know what he's doing with running the radar yet because he's a new guy. So I'm saying, hey, I'm never going to buy another bar in my life if I can shoot an F-16 in an F-4. So I get my fangs out. So I roll upside down, I've got the burner in, I point it down, the airplane accelerates quick like a bunny. So I'm doing about 1.1, 1.2 Mach, and I'm thinking, I've swung this guy's 3.9. What that means is I've gotten behind his wing line. And so I start converting on him, I whirl in left, he's still doing like this. He's looking around. So I'm saying, this is really looking good. So we're coming around the corner like this, when this guy, again, I'm about 4,000 feet from me now, something like that. I said, I'm not going to employ a missile. This is training, it's simulated mission. I think I'll just go for guns, which means I'll embarrass the guy. If you're gonna try and do something great, go big or go home. So I say I'm gonna go down into the history book as gunning an F-16 in an F-4. That's a lot of face. You can put that. So I'm closing on this guy when he sees me. Not good. When somebody really honks on an airplane, really, the man pulls it back, the low pressure on top of the wing is what occurs when the airplane starts to rotate and turn. But when you do that with an F-16, it disappears in a condensation of humidity, or whatever the proper term. You lose sight of the airplane, and it's in this what looks like a cotton ball. And so I'm thinking, I'm in high PRF. PRF is pulse repetition frequency. That's I'm thinking real quick like a bunny now. I'm thinking, uh-oh, he saw me. Now I can't see him. I don't know what his airplane is doing. And so the hair is starting to stand on him. He comes out of this ball when I can see him pointing right square at me. We went by. We got so close that the weight turbulence of his passing aircraft jumbled us. My guy in the back seat said, expletive. And I said, well, what are you going to do? We live, so, you know, there you go. So we completed the turn, and I watched this guy. I still had about 6 G's on the airplane, and I watched this guy go by me, and he went right on my 6 o'clock and said, guns, guns, guns. I did not get any beer for that. I still have. I'm still looking for it. Anybody want to buy me a beer for that story? Anyway, thank you very much for your time.